So I'd like to thank the Southeast Asian Research Center again for having me as a CERT lecturer. As Mark mentioned, this is my fifth lecture, and you can consider me a regular. And then again, who can refuse an invitation from the Professor Mark Thompson, who is also a constant visitor in the Philippines. He's considered already a Filipino, a Pinoy. I would like to speak this afternoon about the Marcos political comeback in the Philippines. And a couple of weeks back, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the son and namesake of the former dictator Ferdinand Edralin Marcos, delivered his second State of the Nation address that marked his first year in power. And he, aside from the regular listing of his so-called achievements in his first year in power, he introduced a new slogan, a marketing slogan for the Philippines. And he said, "I know that the state of the nation is sound and is improving. The new Philippines has arrived." Now, for those of us who are old enough to remember, the new government's slogan, New Philippines, evokes memories of his father's authoritarian rule, which was then called Bagong Lipunan. So, New Philippines, Bagong Pilipinas. His father's regime was called Bagong Lipunan, or New Society. In fact, a couple of years after Ferdinand Marcos placed the entire country under martial law and instituted his authoritarian regime, he reported to the nation, in the 6 years since the proclamation of martial law in 1972 and the establishment of the new society, we have achieved much under the Republic. Of course, up until then, things seemed to be positive for the Bagong Lipunan of Ferdinand Marcos. But after that, everything went haywire. Of course, the rest is history. Eventually, the economy would suffer from external shocks. There would be allegations of massive plunder and corruption with crony capitalism and the like. His arch rival, Benigno Ninoy Aquino, would be assassinated, ushering in a period of great political instability that would result in the first people power uprising and resulting in the ouster of the Marcos dynasty, the Marcos dictatorship in 1986. But then again, several decades after, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., popularly known as BBM, the late dictator's son, was proclaimed the 17th president of the Republic of the Philippines last May 25, 2022. He won a record 31.6 million votes, or 59% of the votes. And the margin was 31% ahead of his closest rival, then Vice President Maria Leni Robredo, who narrowly defeated him in the previous 2016 elections. So after 36 years, the son of the dictator won by a large margin after his family was forced out of the palace by a military-backed people power uprising. So, for scholars who have studied democratization, one of the puzzling outcomes in most countries that underwent democratic transitions is the return to power of personalities who have deep roots in dictatorship. My presentation for this afternoon would like to tackle 3 points. First, how did the Marcos dynasty succeed in staging their political comeback? Second, what factors contributed to the erosion of the post-Marcos liberal reformist political order? And third, what are the prospects for Philippine democracy under a restored Marcos presidency? Now, myth-making is at the heart of the entire Marcos narrative. Truth and the Marcoses have always had a problematic relationship. And 2 generations of the Marcoses created this myth that provided the ideational cement that would bound the different factors that have been identified by various analysts and pundits as the reasons why they were successful in their comeback. Since last year, there have been a lot of explanations provided on the keys to success of the Marcos comeback. Some would say it's about constituencies, bailiwicks. Some would say it's about nostalgia. Some would say it's social media disinformation and propaganda. While all of this provides some explanation to the rise or the return of the Marcos dynasty, these are all, and I would like to assert, necessary but insufficient in explaining the comeback of the Marcoses. And let us discuss myth-making first. Myth-making has always been, as I've said, at the heart of the Marcos narrative. From the very beginning, when he was still plotting his rise to political power from being a representative or a congressman from his home province of Ilocos to becoming senator and eventually planning his campaign to become president and then his re-election, he has exaggerated many of his exploits. True, he was a brilliant law student who was involved in a scandal. He was accused of assassinating his father's arch rival in his province, and he defended himself. And that actually jump-started his political career eventually. And he became one of those guerrilla fighters during the Japanese occupation. But in all of his narration of his personal experiences, there was this element of myth-making. So his astute use of biography and even cinema, which was the most popular mass medium back then, in pursuit of his destiny, to his, even when he became president, actual attempt to rewrite the nation's history in his image. In the Filipino mythological legends, he and his wife Imelda Marcos were the malakas and maganda, the strong and the beautiful legendary deities of Philippine mythology. So Marcosian online propaganda in recent years have revived this myth-making and in fact have normalized the excesses of the older Marcos and martial law and confronts the nation through social media, textbooks, and more recently, they have also produced another set of movies that would try to explain the side of the Marcoses. But the seeds of these exaggerations and even lies and even misrepresentations were planted even a long time ago, during the time of the father. Marcos Sr. had a keen sense of history and his place in it. And he even commissioned some historians from the University of the Philippines to ghostwrite his version of the history of the country from his perspective. So myth-making is the overarching framework. But that's only part of the explanation. Others have pointed to bailiwicks or constituency. There have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elections since the EDSA revolution of 1986. And notice, in all these elections, there have been 3 presidential elections in which there was a clear sweep. In 1998, when the populist former movie actor and action star Joseph Erap Estrada won with a convincing majority, a landslide victory, and in the 2010 presidential election, which saw the rise of the second Aquino presidency, Benigno Noynoy Aquino III, the son of the martyred former Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino and the former President Corazon Aquino. And then in 2022, this massive landslide. Now, in the literature of Philippine elections and Philippine campaigns, the ethno-linguistic vote is the most secure source of votes for national candidates. And this variable has been a consistent predictor of voting behavior since 1946. Specifically, what is known in the literature as bailiwicks, or in Filipino, baluarte, or a candidate's natural area of influence, is indicated by one's ethno-linguistic, regional, or provincial ties. So, definitely, the Marcoses have always been strong in their home region in the north, the so-called solid north, the northern parts of the Philippines. But how did he manage to consolidate the rest of the country, particularly a large swath of the Visayas and Mindanao? So how did BBM consolidate the various ethno-linguistic bailiwicks? The second factor is the consolidation of the country's dominant political dynasties: Arroyos, Duterte, Estrada, Marcoses, Romualdez, and Villar. And, you know, I've written a lot about dynasties in the Philippines. It was a topic of my own doctoral dissertation, and I've been writing about it. But I've always insisted that clans and not political parties have been the building blocks of Philippine politics. No? So we have parties, but it's largely anchored on political clans and families. No? So for the longest time, dynasties have ruled, have dominated Philippine politics. Until 2019, under President Rodrigo Duterte, there was a slight decline in the number of dynasties elected at the local and even national level. And there were some prominent national dynasties who were defeated. Part of the explanation why dynasties have dominated the post-Marcos period is that we can use the concept popularized by James Loxton called authoritarian vestiges. Because most of these clans and dynasties, while they have been integrated in the post-authoritarian democratic order and even joined democratic political parties, most of them were members of the authoritarian regime of Marcos and the authoritarian party of Ferdinand Marcos. So they simply switched from the authoritarian regime, transferred to the democratic parties, but they were still loyal to the dictator, most of them. Okay? So ironically, it was one of the former presidents who's also a member of a political dynasty, former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, no? Ironically, who ascended to power in the second People Power uprising at EDSA. She was the one who orchestrated the consolidation of all this powerful political dynasty to support the tandem of Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte, then mayor of Davao and the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte. So in Game of Thrones lingo, no, the kingdom of the north, the house of Marcos, no, consolidated with the kingdom of the south, the house of Duterte. No? And of course, with the joining of forces between these two, it resulted in that landslide victory and sweep. However, in political marketing and campaign, the role of dynasties and political machineries, patron-client ties, clientelism, etc., they explain the push factor, meaning the machinery and the political bosses that push the candidates to the voters. But it does not explain the pull factor. What was it in BBM or even with Sara Duterte that attracted 31.6 million voters? Now, what drove millions to vote for Bongbong Marcos? So that's another question. Well, the most popular explanation, given even by those who supported the defeated presidential candidate Leni Robredo, is that Marcos benefited from an early investment in massive online propaganda machinery, the use of social media. No? So Marcos Jr. was an early adopter of social media. I don't know if some of you here or if most of you here are active in social media. Were you familiar or are you familiar with Friendster, the precursor of Facebook? No? So some of you are nodding. So I think the only guy in this room who's not on social media or not active is Mark Thompson. No? So, but I see everyone's nodding. No? So it's a precursor of Facebook. No? And as early as 2004, BBM already had a Facebook account. No? By 2010, some slick revisionist videos were circulating online as well, and some pseudo-historic and conspiracy-based website trying to explain the EDSA revolution from the POV. So if you're a social media person, you would know POV, from the point of view of the Marcoses. So pro-Marcos disinformation campaigns have dominated both Facebook and YouTube. The Marcos disinformation machine targeted young voters in TikTok. But then again, while this explanation is convincing, it is incomplete and it fails to account for a simple question or a simple observation. Not all 31 million who voted for BBM were misled. Because if you say that they were just, misled by social media, it's as if they're unthinking robots or zombies who would just accept all the propaganda of the Marcos. And some surveys would show that there were those who believe in the EDSA revolution, who believe in the Aquinos, who actually shifted to supporting Marcos. Why? No? So most actually consciously chose to vote for Marcos. No? So why? No? So some would say it's because of nostalgia. No? Authoritarian nostalgia is, in one form or another, is on the rise, especially in Asia. And authoritarian nostalgia is nostalgia for the authoritarian past. In some Asian countries, it's tantamount or equivalent to the authoritarian developmentalist state, or the developmentalist authoritarianism that were common in Asia. And it can refer to, an aspiration or longing, to bring back the good old days in some cases, authoritarian memories, whether it was successful or not, or whether the success was imagined or not. No? And it points to another argument in the Philippines called democratic ambivalence. And several surveys have pointed, no, based on the Asian Barometer Index, regardless of the percentage of satisfaction with the way democracy works, large majorities of committed Democrats outnumber the minority of conditional Democrats. So they point to democratic ambivalence. While then again, this might be true, a large number of Filipinos prefer democracy, but they prefer a disciplined democracy. They prefer order. There's a need for a strong leader, no? And this is the basis for some of this democratic ambivalence and authoritarian nostalgia. But the problem is, in the Philippines, while we can point to the rise of Duterte and the return of the Marcoses as indicators of democratic ambivalence and authoritarian nostalgia, we miss the fact that there have also been periods in post-authoritarian Philippines in which there were strong periods of democratic nostalgia. People looking back at EDSA, at the People Power Revolution, and how democracy was returned to the Philippines. And this was particularly evident during the EDSA II, People Power Uprising, and the death of Corazon Aquino, which resulted in some form of nostalgia for good governance, which catapulted to the presidency the son, Noynoy Aquino. Okay? So, having said all of these, I propose a framework for trying to tie all of these different explanations. And I use and I adapt one variant of the institutional approach called discursive institutionalism. While there are explanations, while all these explanations are valid and plausible, they are somehow incomplete. Why? Because the analysis offered either robs social actors of agency, or they credit much agential power to Marcos Jr. and his supporters. No? So I would like to view the Marcos victory from the perspective of discursive institutionalism, which is a variant of the institutional approach in political science that highlights the link between ideas and institutions. It emphasizes the explanatory role of ideas and discourses in understanding institutional continuity and change. And one of the proponents of this is the political scientist Vivian Smith. No? So, discursive institutionalism, no? The discursive part asserts that ideas matter, and these ideas are actually stories, no? That give sense to the complexity of the world. No? And these stories are what we call narratives. No? And institutions matter because, like for example, in the Philippines has been considered to have a strong presidency within the weak state, but the narrative that contributes to that institutionalization, the continuing strength of the presidency and the weakening of the state, depends on the discourse. And the key sometimes to change, or the key to explaining continuity and change, is about the narrative. So in the case of the return of the Marcoses, it was a case of changing or flipping the narrative. For the longest time, for 36 years, more than 3 decades, the dominant narrative in the Philippines was that of the liberal reformist narrative. Now, the Marcos narrative, no, can be categorized into 3 acts. The first act, when they were still out of power, is how do they explain the wealth? And this was actually the same dilemma of then politician Marcos while rising up to the different levels of elected political position. He had to explain the source of his wealth. So when Marcos was still a senator and until he became president, he and Imelda Marcos explained that the source of their wealth was the Yamashita treasure. That Marcos actually found the Yamashita treasure, and that was the source of their wealth. No? And this, for the longest time, was the justification. No? Then later on, they invented this high tale, this fairy tale that there was this ancient royalty in the Philippines that hired then lawyer Marcos to become their lawyer, and Marcos was given tons of gold, and this was called the Taliano gold. No? So these tales, these stories, these narratives have been propagated in social media. So that's the first act. Defend the Marcos legacy and the source of their wealth. They point to the golden age when the Philippines was only second to Japan, which is absolutely false, of course. But, nonetheless, it was spread in social media. The second is that they took offense at their ouster and Marcos Jr.'s defeat in the vice presidency in 2016. They played the victims or the victim card. No? The third act, in which now that they're back in power, it is the narrative of redemption. It is their destiny, or it is Bongbong's destiny to complete his father's mission of making the nation great again. Now, the Marcos narrative claims that they were victims of the 1986 People Power Uprising. But victimhood is only one part of the Marcos narrative. The more powerful part is redemption. For most observers, redemption was the only platform Marcos Jr. presented to the electorate in 2022. So some would say that after the his first year in office, well, he's seeking to redeem his family's honor and redress his family's fall. And some are willing to give him a chance. Now, 13 years earlier, another son benefited from political nostalgia. 13 years ago, Corazon Aquino, the former president, died. And suddenly, her death unleashed this nostalgia for the EDSA People Power Revolution and good governance, because this was after years of alleged corruption under the Gloria Macapagal Arroyo presidency. So the death of President Corazon Aquino, reinforced the Aquino narrative, which was supposed to be a democratic narrative. It was a narrative of sacrifice, death, and political resurrection. Noynoy Aquino, this time to use reference to Star Wars, was supposed to bring back balance to the Force, right? So Noynoy Aquino was supposed to revive the liberal reformist narrative, but eventually failed. So in the Philippines, a presidency can be a prequel or a sequel to an ongoing narrative. Given the absence of ideologies and programs, we speak of political narratives as the stories presidents tell. And Mark and I have written extensively on this. We're still working on our book on political narratives, presidential political narratives in the Philippines. So this narrative served to coalesce support from dominant strategic interest groups. These strategic groups can be the military, business, church, civil society, the US, etc., whose backing can make or break a presidency, or what is known in political science as the winning coalition. In the post-Philippine EDSA regime, liberal reformism of Cory Aquino supplanted Marcos's authoritarian developmentalist narrative. Liberal reformism emphasizes the good in good governance. No? It is based on anti-corruption and moral politics. Okay, so until a major challenge, no, a counter-narrative emerged, a traditional populist narrative coming from the former actor, very popular politician Joseph Erap Estrada. No? But his type of populism is a nationalist populism, similar to traditional nationalist populists in Asia. Later on, another populist would emerge who would totally demolish, no, the liberal reformist narrative, and that is the violent populism of Rodrigo Duterte. I will just briefly explain, no, that a presidency can emerge, a presidency can emerge when a political narrative is strong or whether it's weak. And a president can be elected at the time when the dominant narrative is strong or the dominant narrative is weak. My point is that Rodrigo Duterte, no, greatly affected and diminished and even demolished the dominance of the liberal reformist narrative that was founded by Corazon Aquino after EDSA. And it was the populism of Rodrigo Duterte that paved the way for the second coming of the Marcoses. In a way, Rodrigo Duterte was the John the Baptist to the second coming of the Marcoses. Okay? So he paved the way for the return of the Marcoses. Now, the question is whether the election of Bongbong Marcos to the presidency would result in the total repudiation of the EDSA Republic and the revival of the developmentalist regime of the Marcoses, be it authoritarian or not. That is the question. I'll just briefly explain this. Rodrigo Duterte was the product of a long legitimation crisis. Up until 1998, the Philippines was on its way to consolidating its democracy until the ouster of Erap Estrada in the Second People Power Revolution, which ushered in a long period of legitimation crisis that was not really resolved for close to 3 decades. And this resulted in the rise of Duterte and has contributed to the return of the Marcoses. Now, how is the Philippines under the second Marcos presidency? Well, the sky did not fall. No, there were fears that dictatorship would return, etc. But there was a peaceful democratic transition, which was good. There was a return of the presidential style of leadership after Duterte's populist style. BBM appointed technocrats and professionals in the cabinet and gave detailed economic plans and successfully implemented the pandemic exit plans. No, it wasn't really the end of the drug war, but at least there were no more, high-profile bloody incidents. No, there was a foreign policy course correction, especially with regard to U.S. and China. No, but on the negative side, there continues to be some allegations of automated election fraud. No, that's not yet been satisfactorily explained, no, by the government agencies involved. There are still continued troll attacks, disinformation, historical distortion, and even red tagging, even between and among Duterte and Marcos supporters. No, now they're after each other. No, Marcos, the first year of the second Marcos presidency was marked by runaway inflation, particularly the high prices of agricultural products. Ironically, he sits as concurrent Secretary of Agriculture, and he has not appointed any full-time Secretary of Agriculture. He expended a large part of his political capital to setting up a sovereign wealth fund, a Maharlika investment fund. But most people are afraid that this might be a repeat of the same problem in Malaysia, no, with Najib. Then he refuses to fully cooperate with the International Criminal Court in its investigation in the alleged extrajudicial killings under the Duterte administration. And they're this early because in 2025, it would be the midterm elections in the 6-year term of the president. There are already emerging cracks in his ruling coalition. So what are the prospects? What are the possible scenarios under the second Marcos presidency? A number of those who did not vote for him, as I've said, are willing to give him a chance. Some of those who voted for Leni Robredo are happy with his foreign policy decision. Some of his allies within the Duterte camps are still aligned with him. No, so redemption is within his reach if he will avoid his father's mistake. No, so there are 4 possible scenarios. No, well, one is he will repudiate eventually the EDSA Republic. He will push for constitutional change. He will lift term limits. He might even change the form of government to federal parliamentary. Or second, he will just be Marcos Light. And that's actually what he is right now, Marcos Light. No? Not as ruthless or brilliant as his father, Machiavellian up to a certain extent, more of a soft authoritarianism, or again, as the millennials would call it, GV, good vibes, no, instead of OG strongman, right? Then he might even be like Noynoy Aquino, no, benign, no, who will go through the motions, appoint technocrats, read his speeches well, attend state visits, and stick to the narrative, just like Noynoy Aquino stick to his narrative of tuwid na daan, no, or the straight path. Or we might see a K-drama, no, like Park Geun-hye, the daughter of South Korean Park Chung-hee, who apologized for the sins of her father and was elected the first woman president of South Korea, but she was impeached, no, accused of corruption. So this is just the beginning. A lot will still happen. And thank you very much for your kind attention.